rails. Cut your radio IP.
Great. Thanks. Okay, first on our agenda is approval of last meeting's minutes. Are there any changes to the minutes? If none, is there a motion for approval?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
January service changes.
So logging in, I'll officially introduce you guys to Stefan Marks. He is, as he announced us out, the new Chief Development Officer. So this will hopefully be my last kind of interim position to hand all of these over to Stefan. But we are very excited to have him. It's been what? This is the third week?
Yeah.
Third week.
Is that why you're smiling so big?
A little bit above one. A little bit, getting there.
I'm smiling too, so that's good. Yeah.
I have a more detailed version also to the. You can have it. No, sure.
Jody.
No, thank you.
Are you in Ring Central? Are you in Ring Central? You want me to just give you the number? One 424 2347.
All right, January service update. Just gonna launch into it here. First up, we have the pulse. So right now, if you can, well, it's really tiny, follow on the weekday. It's 10 during the day, 15 peak, 30 at night. The proposal is to do 10 across the board until we hit that late night service. And for the Saturdays at 15 all day. So we're gonna leave that. And this proposal is for Sunday. Instead of switching at 30 minutes at peak, it'll be 15 throughout the day. And then just switching to 30-minute late night. Next up is our Route 1 extension.
Just a quick question. There's no pullback on any of the schedule. It's just increased frequency.
Next up, we have our 1A lining at Spring Rock Green, which is that little divot out here. It's actually going to continue down the Lothian Turnpike to Walmart Way. The recommendation here is to do 30-minute service on weekday and Saturday until 7 p.m. and 60-minute late night. And then Sunday for Saturday, excuse me, weekday and Saturday. And then the Sunday service will go from 45 minutes all day to 40 minutes. So not a lot shift there, but we wanted to make sure the ones all aligned where they are that trunk service to keep that running. And it will also extend to Walmart Way. Our Route 5 is restoration of our pre-COVID frequency that we used to have. So this is restoration service on Saturday. Weekday, we brought back last booking, so our next step is our Saturday service, going 15 minutes up till 7, and then still keeping that 30 minutes in the evenings. Route 19 is an extension, so a little short extension, just a little farther down to change the end of line to Sheltering Arms, which is just across the Goochland line. It would run every 15 minutes, weekday, Saturday, and still keeping 30 on Sunday. And the idea here is that every other trip would change the end of line. So one trip will do Aldi as the end of line, next trip would do Sheltering Arms.
That is the West Creek, said the West Creek development.
Wilkes Ridge, I'm not sure the West Creek.
Then-
West Creek's on the other
There's a couple of hotels in that loop too that would be having access to service.
There's a hotel and medical offices and all that in there.
Questions on this one? Route 20 is our orbital. This will also be a little bit of restoration going to 30 minutes instead of all day for weekday, Saturday, Sunday, instead of our current, which has some 60-minute service off peak and late night. Route 29, this is our express route. So we are looking at adding a couple of especially where you see the max load and those little higher numbers. So we'll be adding back in a 340 trip to take some weight off of that 405 and adjusting the 415 trip a little bit later to 435 and adjusting the 535 trip again, just a little bit later to 540 to kind of even out that spacing with the added trip. For the 91, we are switching it from 60-minute service all day to bringing back that 30-minute peak service. And then our 93 is the micro transit, which I won't get into too much. But we are launching micro transit soon in this zone. So for this January booking, it would be the removal of the Route 93, kind of going along with that project. And then we are proposing some bay changes for the downtown transfer station. This is scheduling, operations, all worked together with the one entrance and exit for the facility. We had a little bit of challenges with the really frequent routes being those first couple B and C right as you come in, causing a little bit of backup. So we're going to center all of the high frequency routes to the center of the complex, leaving more room on the outside to kind of keep that flow of traffic a little better.
Do you want to show me 1A again? Thanks.
We can give it to you. You can study it.
Express used to be the Lowe's, right?
Any questions on the service changes? Thank you very much. Next on our agenda is micro.
Sure.
I'll come up front. Well, everybody, I'm gonna stand if that's okay. Well, maybe not because this camera is right there. I'm gonna sit, sorry. As I told everybody earlier, I am Dry Guerrero, the microtransit manager. I'm still very new here, so please forgive me, Adrienne, if I stumble over anything, please correct me if I'm wrong. But that said, VIA will be in-house this coming week. VIA is our technology provider for microtransit. We'll be doing all of our training next week, drivers, everybody who's going to be trained to actually run the actual service. Our soft launch date is going to be October 30th. So this is very soon. We're going to be actually launching the service, running it with our full launch, full scale for the 2 weeks coming November 6th and November 13th for those 2 periods. After that, once we've gotten that kind of under our belt, we're going to start transitioning and focusing on our next zones, which are going to be Powhatan, Ashland, New Kent, and North Chesterfield. Powhatan and Ashland are scheduled or slated to go at the beginning of March. So that's going to be March 1st. There is an RFP out right now to bring some third-party providers to help run those rural areas. For New Kent and North Chesterfield, February 1st is kind of our tentative date, or February at some point. It's kind of our tentative date. We need to sit down and kind of go over the actual hard start date for us.
That's Ashland.
Sorry,
Ashland and North Chesterfield.
Ashland and North Chesterfield. I apologize. Yes. I wrote it backwards. Sorry.
Actually, Chesterfield is February.
Yep.
Powhatan, New Kent is March.
Thank you.
And New Kent is probably, sorry.
Oh, good.
You want to say the first one that's come? I don't think you mentioned the actual name for everyone else. That's the one that's launching October 30th.
Azalea. Did I not say Azalea? I apologize if I didn't say Azalea. Azalea Zone is our October 30th launch. And actually, she showed the zone. It's that red outline that you all saw with the 93 that will be going away. 93, correct. This microtransit will be 93 in a sense.
So the hatched area that was in the red, that's the replacement.
Correct. And microtransit, everybody will be able to feed into. I believe there's 4 zones in the area that they'll be able to feed into to get to fixed route and come downtown, other areas that they need to go. So that's it. Any questions? Yes.
And actually, before my question, so the Azalea one actually loops up into Hanover.
Correct. Yep. Yes.
So you mentioned the New Kent one. Is that the one that also serves Far Eastern Connecticut by area?
Correct.
Yeah, and we're actually looking more at May for that one, because we're working now with the consultant to do an additional survey to determine kind of what is the exact footprint of that zone, what's the demand for it as well. So that will be kind of our last zone as we work out.
Big zone.
Yeah, right now
It's a massive zone. It's one of our bigger ones, if I'm not mistaken. That in Ashland. So, but yeah, any questions on dates?
No, but I would like to mention Chesterfield was able to get a raised planning grant, which it's in the Hopkins Chippenham area. That was a zone we looked at. And in that grant, we said that we would look at ways to implement microtransit in that area. So we're not under contract with FHWA yet. We're still working on that, but we're definitely going to need to work with you. And
Wonderful. Absolutely. Well, I am here whenever you need me. I can answer questions. I don't know if my email has been sent out to everybody, but it'll eventually get out there and make it way to everybody. So if there's any questions about microtransit, please reach out.
don't worry.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is
This one's not a presentation, just an overview of where we are so far. So for the 10-year plan, we have completed our chapter 1, which is the system overview and strategic vision, as well as our appendix A, which is the agency profile as well, and chapter 2, which is our system performance and operations analysis. And so we are well into chapter 3, which is our planned improvements and modifications. We'll be holding a service planning meeting to go over that draft recommendations as far as the route level analysis. We've done one internally, we'll do one again tomorrow. Before that goes out for round 2 public engagement, which will be as soon as the end of this month, once we get those recommendations, the last comments on that draft in. The phase 2 engagement will consist of pop-up events, public meetings, and then a survey that will be pushed out to all of our social media and to our jurisdictional partners.
so you've completed existing conditions. And now you're working on potential changes. Yes. And that's what the public engagement is for.
After round 2 engagement, then we'll start our implementation plan and then the financial plan.
You say improvements analysis, is that almost on route improvements or route evaluation? Is there any other, that's what you focus on, is that not anything operation, correct? Just getting transit where it needs to be,
It serves as a whole, so it is like frequency adjustments, route realignment.
but all route related, all passenger and customer oriented towards getting our resources to the right places where they're.
We'll look at capital as well.
That's all I have.
Okay, and that whole plan will be done at the end of April. All right, any other questions for? The next is capital project updates. There's a lot of.
Yes, and I'm gonna just verbally go through them with you fairly quickly, because a lot of them are thankfully closing out. We'll be moving into the next phases. So the facilities master plan is a little bit of background. That one was looking at our current facility, how we're currently utilizing it, and understanding how we've kind of already outgrown it, and looking at our expansion needs. So what minimal changes we need to do to kind of survive in the interim, and what changes we need to do on a grander, knowing that expansion is coming. And then our 325 East Belt Boulevard, which I'm trying not to call the church lot anymore, what we can conceptually do with that. So they're doing some conceptual designs as well, to again look at where we need to be with growth, fleet needs, and all of that. That should be closed out, I believe, by November. And we're looking at that to determine what we can apply for grant-wise for any capital changes in the next grant cycle. Zero emission transition plan, which actually will tie directly into that. We're also closing that one out. The official study is complete, but we need to kind of sign off on it. So this month, and what they did is they looked at battery electric as well as hydrogen fuel cell, and looked at our current facility, how we're utilizing compressed natural gas, diesel, and looked at more or less what the ability is for electric, what the cost is for that, what are the limitations, what kind of structure needs we need to change. And then they looked at the same thing for hydrogen fuel cells, came down to lots of paths you could go in. But ultimately, we have kind of determined that the electric, as far as being able to, the topography of the region and all of that, with the battery electric, we really just can't go that far with the current degradation of the batteries, unless it's certain routes. So being a little bit strategic about that. So as far as kind of our overall overhaul, time is not right. So they gave us basically what would be that transition plan. I want to say was something close to 35 years before like our current fleet based on the replacement cycle, and when the batteries would actually be ready based on being able to replenish themselves a little bit longer, replace us. And then as far as hydrogen fuel cell, it really was a 1-for-1 more or less with the compressed natural gas, being able to make the distance, but then there's no hydrogen fuel cell around here. So kind of that one's a kind of waiting game. Once it kind of changes with the market as far as availability, we'll revisit that. For now, going back to the facilities master plan, we want to at least do a pilot for electric vehicles. So we're looking at piloting a few of them, and that will be an opportunity for our staff to get training on it, as well as be able to just see how it works for the region. And we'll strategically use it on routes where the bus can be parked for multiple hours to be able to completely be recharged. So that's that study. BRT station modifications.
Just real quick on the question. Is there any part of the goals of GRTC that is mandated, or is this trying to be, leaders in this? What portion, or if any, is mandated?
Yeah, not specifically within our agency, except where we have to start exploring it. But I know more on the federal guidelines and like the money that's out there. there is, and I'm not going to say it right, but it says in the beginning of the study.
You want to be in a
there are
position to,
specific
want to
legislation-
be in a position to
Right,
be able to require something.
right. But they do have specific dates. I don't know what it is, but years that by this point in time, they want the majority of vehicles within fleets to be some sort of zero emission.
Are we following that or are we doing that and then some? Or is an organization?
So that's why we looked at did the transition plan in the beginning to figure out what we need to do, at least be in line with that sort of policy change. So we will begin to do the turnout, but of course, we don't want to end up having 500 vehicles and that's just not even cost effective, or to have to park them so they can charge half the day, opposed to put them on the street. So we will follow the transition, but the transition says that we can basically spend the next 35 years to be able to get there.
That's the thing that seems to be, talk about the policy goals versus actual
Right.
check for certain things that aren't quite
We
ready.
don't align it. So we'll follow it, but like I said, we'll pilot it, so we'll be ready. And then as the batteries improve, let's say over the next 5 years, then that could change in terms of the replacement cycle. So the end of projection, and I can see the chart in my head, and I know Cheryl knows the one I'm talking about, that was just so confusing. But they just show like slowly over time that eventually the battery ability gets there. And therefore our replacement can be more electric and less some CNG and some electric. BRT station modification. They are done with engineering for that, and we are looking to go out for bid for construction. Heard that it should take probably to the end of next summer to be able to get the stations all modified.
What's the funding source?
We have a DRPT grant that's matched with local and FTA. Dedicated lane study. This is one that has recently kicked off. Got the funding for a little bit though, I think from FY21. It was, the original intent was to bring our current BRT up to the 50% requirement to be a real BRT, and then the repair funds. We worked with the city and we were actually able to accomplish that. So we are above that 50%. It might be like 50.6, but we've made it over. This is still looking at opportunities for more operational improvements, like around the state building. When they let them out on 14th Street downtown, we get really backed up in both directions. So some improvements like that. And then beyond the BRT, what are additional roads that would benefit us operationally, working with the jurisdiction, city in particular, for doing dedicated lanes.
That's phase 2, that part of it. Phase
Yeah.
1 is the 14th Street stuff.
Correct. East End Neighborhood Transfer Station. This is 23rd and Franklin, which is our Shockoe Bottom Station, in front of the CVS. That one, when it was designed, we had the network redesign. It was supposed to be a consolidated station. The bus stop itself is like up a really steep hill, and people are having to cross a non-signalized intersection to be able to make it to the local stop. It's not safe. I think there's been quite a few near misses. So what kind of improvements can we do so that we can do amenities there? We can't put them on the grade. So if we can maybe make them closer to the current bus stop, or is it a location we need to go to that would be able to accommodate that? So we're working with Kimberly Horn on that, and they have a few alternatives. Permanent transfer station TOD study, I think we officially kicked that off. Well, semi-kicked that off yesterday. And we'll be doing a in-person kickoff next Thursday downtown. So this one is to look at kind of what is the need for our footprint, and then working with the city very closely, kind of as a project partner, determine like what that location should be in the downtown area, and looking at it from the aspect of transient-oriented development. So there would be kind of a return on investment, not just for operations, but for the city itself as well.
When is that one going to be?
It's a 6-month study, so I guess 6 months from now. Essential transfer infrastructure study, that one is just rolling. When did we get in yesterday?
We did 3.
Three yesterday.
We have another 200 plus to go, but we can get there.
That's the shelters. So 3 shelters went in yesterday. You got your one of 3 shelters. So I think we finally have things lined up in terms of engineering, a little bit of contract administration from Kimberly Horn, as well as some engineering inspection for RK&K. And we all have resources now. Stefan overseeing it. We also have our capital improvement program manager now, and then Raquel. So that team is kind of full force to move this forward. And she, I think, brings to the board this month a lot of shelter purchases. So they're
This will be
excited about
bringing
that.
50.
50? Okay. Pulse Extension West. Well, the study itself, the first phase was complete back in, I think, May. So we have submitted the scope and should be getting it in the next couple of weeks as far as proposal. We are going with our bench contract on this one, which is STV. And we hope to be able to kick that off hopefully by the beginning of November for the study, for that study. North-South BRT, I am going to kick that over to Nick as we are closing out the first phase of that extension.
Thank you, Adrian. So we've been working on this for about 10 months. And so I want to stress that I will be as detailed as possible for 10 months of work in about 10 minutes. But if you have any questions, please let me know while we're going through this. And I'm also going to really quickly apologize for my voice. I did about a month's worth of talking in the last 3 days. So it's caught up to me. But just quickly over the agenda, we're gonna basically step through it sort of like chronologically and sort of kind of higher to lower. So we will be looking at kind of why we're doing this project, what we're looking at, and how we sort of narrow down all the different options, what we sort of considered when we were looking at those options, and then finally the goal of getting that locally preferred alternative and what the next steps are going to be. So this process is by no means complete. I just wanted to stress that this is the very first phase, and I'll go over kind of a timeline of that. But the goal here really is to give us guidance, or give GRTC guidance on sort of moving forward with a BRT north in the north-south corridor, or a north-south corridor. So, like I said, it's looking at that new BRT route for, between the north and south. The goal is to really, expand the footprint for the connections between the neighborhoods, jobs, and all the different kind of activity centers that you'll have in the city, just similar to the existing Pulse line on Broad Street. This just basically crosses that. And so the goal is to really expand that footprint overall. And then through that expansion, the hope is that there's echoes of improvements on the other services throughout the area. So the local bus service, the microtransit on Azalea, for example, is one part that would connect to this. All of those different additional services that are coming into play over the next few years would be benefited by this additional service as well. And of course, we want to support the local redevelopment and economic goals of Henrico, Chesterfield, and the city of Richmond through this. So a lot of what we looked at is kind of development potential or redevelopment potential, and some of the impacts on housing and equity and things like that throughout the neighborhoods. So we started off with basically 4 routes prescribed by GRTC that we wanted to look at. These came out of past studies. But really just kind of narrowing it down, it starts up kind of near VCC, up on US 1 North, then all the way down just south of 288. Actually, that's past John Tyler or Wright Point Community College in the south. And then, of course, we looked at 60 and 360 coming out of the city on the south side. So those are the sort of main corridors, but once you get to that downtown area, what you're really looking at is, as you can see, kind of a spider web of different options. They're not unlimited, but there's certainly any number of different routes we can take to get from the top to the bottom. So really what we had to do is look at what combinations actually work, what are possible, and then crossing the bridges. We're not talking about building a new bridge. We want to work with what's existing. So we really were limited to the 3 bridges, US 1, Manchester Bridge, and of course the Mayo Bridge on 14th. So how do we narrow down all those options? We wanted, like I said, we wanted to go from all these different possibilities to sort of a smaller set of potential service recommendations. So first thing we did was define all these different options into smaller segments. So we looked at 2, 3, 4 block segments. Some of them are longer. You go out into the counties, those segments get longer because you're obviously working with more geography and a little bit more spread out. And then we wanted to look at what criteria we were supposed to use to determine which of these segments is best. As you can see on the bottom there in the three green boxes, we basically broke down all the different criteria into three types: demographic and land use metrics, transit connectivity, that's connectivity with the existing and planned services, and then multimodal connectivity. So that's, the accessibility comes into play there, equity comes into play as well. So when we did this, what we found, this map's a little hard to read, but basically the darker the color you see on a line, the better that segment performed in a specific category. So the blue lines are multimodal connectivity, the gray lines are transit connectivity, and the green ones are diversity in land use. So the darker the color, the better that segment performed. Now, there's sort of a mix of quantitative and qualitative here. So it's not really totally analytical, but the idea was to really look at each of these segments individually and sort of determine on its own, not adding the other parts, but just on its own, how does that segment perform when we're looking at all these different criteria?
Is it fair to say that this is a combination of data and professional judgment?
Yes, there's a little bit, yeah, and there's data all kind of goes into it. Everything has some data attached to looking at sidewalks and things like that. But then there's sort of, understanding kind of how those different segments connect to the next one in the line. So yeah, there's a little bit of both in this particular phase. So when we took the results of this, we went through public meetings and kind of talked about what this meant. I mean, we could see the map on paper, but what does it actually mean? This is obviously a schematic map that doesn't show roads really. It's just showing sort of like directionality. What we end up with is basically two decisions that we had to make. First one is, what is the route going to be through downtown and how do we get across the river? So we basically looked at that as a singular question. And then we knew what the north was going to look like. We wanted, we were on Chamberlain Avenue. We kind of knew where it was going to start. We wanted to connect into the microtransit and the extension that's forthcoming. But we wanted to really see, once you get to that sort of Lombardi intersection, where do you go from there? And then the second question was, where's that endpoint on the south side? Not only are we looking at three different corridors, but you had multiple options on each of the corridors to look at. So we basically broke it down into two for evaluating this, sort of going through the actual analysis. We broke it down into two questions. What are we doing downtown? And then what are we doing on the south side? Because if you'll notice, all the routes that sort of ended up being the highest scores in that prior phase, they all come to a point right there at the corner of the Commerce or Route 1 and 360. So everything sort of meets at that intersection. So you really basically, you can get everything there and then you have another decision after that. So it helped us a little bit with flexibility. Not everything on the south side wasn't necessarily dependent on what happened downtown, and vice versa. Yes. And so what ends up happening is that you get 9 total alternatives from this. You have 3 options downtown and then the 3 options on the south side. You'll notice that those lines are dashed downtown. The reason for that is that we're looking at corridors, not necessarily routes. We're not really prescribing a turn-by-turn option right now. There are future steps for that process, but we're kind of showing there's one's on the east side, kind of one's on the west side. One hits VCU, one hits the downtown area. There's sort of a combination. So we looked at these 9 alternatives, then we moved them forward to the additional analysis where we really wanted to break down the numbers. So this is much more where kind of data plays in a role. And so I won't go through these in all detail, but I wanted just to show kind of the different, kind of what we're looking at. So some of them may have very tangential relationship to like kind of like BRT, but we're also looking at like TOD development and things like that. We looked at property values because there's a lot of questions about, replacement of neighborhoods and sort of changing who lives where. And we wanted to look at like watershed coverage, things like that. How do people get there? Is there equitable ways of accessing the corridors that BRT are in? We also wanted to look at job access. That's a big one because there are a lot of jobs on the south side that are not, currently accessible. There are services, the 1A and so forth, that do lead you there, but the goal here is to sort of combine it into a larger, higher capacity higher frequency service. So we also looked at, some of these tangential measurements like sidewalk density, sidewalk conditions. It's a lot easier to replace a sidewalk than it is than build a sidewalk. So a lot of that came into play. We looked at bicycle facilities, a lot of planned, trails and things like that through the city. And then we looked at existing pedestrian volumes and foot traffic, and just to see kind of, are we seeing what the numbers are telling us? Is that actually reflected in the data that we get from people actually moving and kind of measuring with their phone?
To keep interrupting.
Yeah, no problem.
Page back on
Yeah.
land use.
Yes.
Can you describe future land use? Was that a look into the county's localities comprehensive plan? Was it communication directly with the counties?
Yeah, so we worked with the counties in the city, and we also looked at their comp plans and looked at the corridors in question, not very specific parcels, but like kind of a general trend of what that land use in the future would look like. So it's not based on zoning, it's very much based on sort of a future condition of, are we looking at something that would support BRT because it's higher density, it's commercial, mixed use, things like that. So yes. And parcelization, just to make a point, is basically the number of parcels you have to work with. The higher the number of parcels you work with, the harder it is to redevelop. So it's just a measure of kind of where redevelopment is more likely. So this on its own doesn't mean anything, but what I want to show is that basically, like I said, we've broken up the criteria. There are different metrics within each of those criteria that you have on this left-hand side here. But we had the 9, the alternatives, the 3 in the south and the 3 downtown that we looked at. Downtown east, downtown middle, downtown west. That basically just means kind of where it is relative to the other options. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything on its own. And of course, on the south side, you have the different corridors that we looked at. We played around with the weighting on these, but we found that a lot of the scores weren't terribly affected by that unless you did some drastic skewing of numbers. But this weight seemed to reflect a lot of what we heard from the public and from the stakeholders about what's important and what's kind of what we should be looking at, or what the counties or the cities are looking for in the future. And what we found basically on the scores is that the Midlothian Turnpike alternative performed a whole lot better. Relatively speaking, the scores don't necessarily mean anything by themselves, but compared to the other alternatives, they performed better. And then in downtown, the option on the east side of downtown and sort of the west side of downtown, those performed effectively equally. So they both did better than the one that sort of split the difference. So there were additional things that we needed to look at to figure out, kind of help us through this. Midlothian Turnpike, very much an option that we thought was probably going to move forward. So we didn't table that, but we definitely looked a little bit more in detail about, how that ended and where you have potential termini. But what we really wanted to focus on is the public's comments, not only on, what's important for analyzing and kind of looking at these different corridors, but downtown, what are the trade-offs they want to take to? Are they more interested in going to VCU and then taking a transfer to get to downtown, or would they rather go to downtown than have the transfer to VCU on the pulse? So we looked at these trade-offs and kind of the detail that we got from the pop-up meetings, the events at GRTC. I think GRTC went out to the transfer center and talked to people. So we got all this sort of feedback through surveys and all, just kind of, all of it's anecdotal, all of it sort of tells you a story. But what we're going to do is, what does that story mean? We're trying to define it and sort of apply it to what we're looking at. And so what we found is that Midlothian Turnpike was very popular. The one that people liked. The job access was very important. Job access in general, especially the downtown, was a big driver, or they wanted to see that to be a big driver, sort of our locally preferred alternative. And then having that, the access, and then crossing at Manchester seemed to be the best option. But we wanted to look a little bit more at that. One thing to keep in mind is that early discussions with the city of Richmond about Mayo kind of led us to not really consider that very much, because basically it leads you to it funnels you down. It only really allows you to leave that area through Hull Street Road. And if you know Hull Street at that particular area, it's very narrow. It's very tight, not a particularly good alternative. So Manchester, of the 2 bridges that were left, Manchester and Route 1, Manchester was by far and away the best one. What also helped with that is the fact that there are already future improvements for Manchester Bridge Plan, which include dedicated lanes. And as Adrian mentioned earlier, that percentage of dedicated lanes that kind of goes into a route makes a difference in kind of your funding. So having that pre-wrapped project, that project that's already sitting there that we could leverage definitely helps us with kind of moving forward. So just real quick.
Go back one to the weighting. Can you, so am I right in saying that, like, when you look at job and population density with a 40, the weighting is saying that that seemed to be the highest concern?
Yeah, so a lot of different factors went into the weighting, like the feedback from public and then sort of stakeholder input and everything's like, and just kind of other kind of best practices. But the 40 indicates that that's the highest score in each alternative could possibly get. So in terms of kind of, for example, Downtown East scored, it does not one's perfect, but they basically scored the highest score based on kind of how it was weighted. So yeah, so multimodal analysis, that's like things like sidewalk connections and things like that. We scored a little bit lower because those are not as expensive. They're not cheap, but they're certainly not as expensive improvements that you can make. So there are certain things that where you can't make a neighborhood more dense very easily. Single family residents, single family population patterns, you were sort of set with that. So there are certain things that you can change and not change, or a city can change and not change over time. So we weighted based on sort of what, not only what we're expecting in the future, but also current conditions that sort of, kind of stand that test of time. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I'm going into the weeds of the blue column and how those numbers ended up the way they were versus.
Those are just maximums. So that's the highest score for that category that a person didn't get. And one other thing that we looked at, just to mention, is additional service that GRTC is providing in the future. Adrian also mentioned, or Tricia, sorry, mentioned the 1A extension in the future. We looked very closely at that, and then the service on the north side and that Azalea Avenue, which is hidden kind of behind that thing there. But these are services that are already kind of on the books. So these are ways we can connect to that. And when you connect to other options that are open, whether it's microtransit or just local service that goes different places, you kind of expand that footprint even more. So that was another particular consideration we looked at. So the locally preferred alternative, that was sort of what we were working towards this entire time. The goal is to develop an alternative. I want to stress alternative and not an alignment. An alternative that we would move forward and GRTC would look at for future study. And in that future study, I'll get into that, but there's much more detail involved in that. And but we want to really push them in a certain direction or give them the guidance to where to sort of focus our efforts on. So the alternative that we recommended for a local preferred alternative is the combination of the downtown east corridor and the Midlothian Turnpike corridor. So I want just to, again, we're not looking at turn by turn directions yet. We're not there yet. But really what we're looking at here is a combination of going through downtown, which is near the state capitol complex and then the VCU Medical Center campus, using the Manchester Bridge to cross the James River, and then using Hull Street and Belt Boulevard to get to Midlothian Turnpike. So just the local preferred alternative just goes right by here on Belt Boulevard, and then it goes out to Midlothian Turnpike. As you can see on the arrow for Midlothian Turnpike, it says to Chesterfield Town Center. I'll get into that in a little bit. We like that alternative or that option for a terminus because the 1A was going to Walmart Way, which is just past Chesterfield Town Center. So we wanted to sort of mimic that. If we're going to recommend it, it doesn't necessarily mean that will end up being where it goes, but at least it gives us some template to look at, and we'll have ridership numbers like that next few years. So there's a lot more work to do to look at that corridor in Midlothian. We anticipate that there'll be a phased approach to all of this. And then, of course, when that service goes in on the 1A in January, I believe. Yeah, well, GRTC will be looking at those numbers and seeing kind of, is there support for quarter or additional service in that quarter? And, BRT doesn't, you don't really want to put BRT on a route that doesn't have a bus. So it's a very good kind of alternative to look at what you have in service already. So that it takes us up to this big yellow star right here, which is the first step, like I said, in this process. We are doing the planning and getting to a locally preferred alternative. We're reaching the end of that, and then the next step would be project development. At that point, we would be looking a lot more at the specific roads, intersections, lights, rights of way, traffic impacts, the bridges that this bus would be using, things like all those different impacts. That's all looked at much more detail because it's through an environmental process, working under a federal, guidelines for that. And so a lot of that kind of where the dedicated lanes are, how the buses interact with intersections, the traffic lights, all that stuff is something that we look at in the future. And through that process, there will be a considerably more in public engagement. So we're going to be talking to people, working with specific communities along corridors and to really kind of do more of that outreach and then help us kind of locate stations and things like that. So the end result of that project development is a 30% design, sort of an idea of where the route's going to go. And then, of course, like I said earlier, we'd be, GRC would be looking at that 1A extension and how it's working on the Midlothian Turnpike to really get a good handle on where the route could go on the south side. So any questions on the locally preferred alternative before I go into a little bit more on Midlothian Turnpike?
NEPA studies are taking a long time, right, aren't they?
They are actually limited. There's project development, and then there is an actual, what's the word? Time frame. So they are not taking as long as they used to. Okay. That's good news. Yeah. So we wanted to look a little bit more at Midlothian Turnpike to determine a couple of things. For one, Midlothian Turnpike scored a lot better because it did a lot better on job access. Well, it's also the longest corridor that we looked at on South Side. It's longer than the Hull Street corridor, and it's also longer than the US 1 corridor. So we want to make sure that the reason we are getting those good scores isn't necessarily because of the length, and where we want to determine where is the trade-off on the corridor. So we picked 6 options for potential termini. Starting at Southside Plaza, kind of moving to the west, Stonebridge, which is where the service currently, the 1A currently ends, Gateway Center, which is just before Poway Parkway, Pocono Crossing, which is just there at Robius Road, and then finally moving to Chesterfield Town Center at Courthouse Road, all the way to Walmart Way. So we had multiple options that we looked at, and we reran the analysis on job access, especially to determine kind of what those results were. And so what happened was, and these charts sort of, they tell, the shapes tell a story more than the numbers, but basically what you see is that the improvements as you move east to west grow considerably, job access wise, especially until they kind of level off at a certain point. So on this map over here, the different lines represent different populations of people that would have access to new jobs within 60 minutes. So in other words, within a 60-minute commute, what more percentage jobs could they get to? So for example, I'll pick one, areas of persistent poverty is this orange line here. So as you can see, it kind of jumped when Southside Plaza, the number of jobs you can get access more is not as great. But as you move further west on the corridor, it jumps up until you get to Pocono Crossing, which is about the Robius Road intersection. And then you get it kind of levels off a little bit. That doesn't mean it's not going up still, but it's definitely there's diminishing returns. So again, there's a lot of considerations here. The dedicated lane percentage, comes into play. Every mile you add is another 50% of dedicated lanes, or half mile you have to add of that. So we wanted to kind of show where, how far you have to go in Chesterfield to really get these positive benefits, but also kind of where that minimum might be. And all things considered, the results do level off on Robius. It does not mean that it has to stop there. It doesn't mean that the first phase has to go there. It just means that ultimately that's where you get the sort of most efficient, or the biggest change in terms of jobs job access. So that was a lot. So any questions?
That Chesterfield Marketplace on the graph, is that Chesterfield Town Center that you're talking about?
It is, Chesterfield Marketplace is on, I think it's on the west side of courthouse.
It's the Alverser Loop.
Yeah, like
That
where
would
you're-
be better.
It looked like the loop physically on the map was going down Alverser, and it made a loop there. I was just trying to.
Yeah, it does. I think that's back where there's the shops.
Oh. Okay.
So
around
Old
these-
Buckingham is right here.
Value City.
Yeah. And again, this is just for testing purposes, the actual,
I was just trying to get
that basically is just the courthouse.
naming understood in my brain. What was going on.
And then this piece is Walmart Way, which is down across from the Wegmans, bottom of the hill. So that was a lot, I know, but any questions on kind of where we're going? I want to reemphasize that this is not the end of anything. We might have a much larger, you know, there's a larger, this is a piece of a larger process, but it does give GRTC some direction on kind of where to focus resources in the future. And the 1A, of course, that extension does help Chesterfield look and see kind of how transit performs, especially, you know, going out to that far beyond where it currently stops. So it gives a good template for BRT in the future. So there's a couple of plot processes that would feed into this as well.
How helpful were the pop-up meetings and your committee and the events that you had to get feedback and what you came up with?
Some of them were good, but what you'll find with kind of public meetings, especially with these public transit projects that are maybe 8 years out or 7 years out, is that they're not real enough for a lot of people to react to. So you get people that are very interested in transit already. So you get a little bit more of kind of a selected group. But Henry with GRTC and his team, I believe they went out to the transfer center. They went out to, did they go out Southside Plaza? Yeah, and talk to people who would probably never, you know, participate in a survey or go to a meeting and run and talk to them and say, like, you know, kind of ask questions like, you know, are Milliken Turnpike more interesting to you? Hull Street more interesting, and things like that. So I would say that those kind of one-on-one or the pop-ups where you go to where the people are far more effective overall in getting their sort of riders input. But, you know, you just have to mix it all together and kind of look at the results.
So, I don't really think this would happen, but let's say the 1A extension wasn't as successful. That ridership on Route 111. If we needed to shift gears, I guess we can't do that because of how it's. We wouldn't be able to shift over.
No, well, so it depends on kind of where you're talking about where you shift. So everything sort of comes to a point at that one intersection. So in theory, yes, you could always switch gears there. You'd lose a lot of that job access, the benefits and things like that. So it definitely changes the results. But if that were the decision being made, yeah, you could just, you know, turn left there off Hull Street and then.
But as
continue.
far as the study goes, we'll be able to evaluate 1A in this upcoming year and just make sure we're good.
Yes.
And if we're not, then we can do something.
And you know, the evaluation will be more deep, you know, looking at what stops or, you know, maybe there is a drop off of ridership at a certain point. So that's where you start looking at the phasing, where if ridership's great till Rovius and then sort of dies, you know, just as an example, maybe that is the good term. So that's that's kind of thing we look at.
And then we're down. That's actually what I have. Sometimes there's that ramp up, which is also challenging since this is a winter demo. But I'm assuming we'll be able to find some money.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Well, I thought you did a really good job on this one.
Thank you.
It's been hard for me to kind of get my.
Yeah, a lot of those kind of impacts on Midlothian Turnpike, especially where you don't have the service now, we can assume that we'll know what we'll look at. But when you get into that next phase, the NEPA and the environmental, you really do look at those impacts in the right of way, and that like the medians and the sidewalks, all that stuff sort of comes into play. It's just we're just shoving sort of the ball in that direction at this point.
Does anyone else have questions?
If the product should miss the expectation. Similar way, like, who are the fortunes ever since it's been. If that's the case, then I assume that once everything comes to fruition, and I drove all the way to Chesapeake Town Center, and there's a lot more access to jobs and opportunities. So I don't think that the routership on Route A shouldn't be an issue, given the fact that not only all those opportunities that are available, but based on, the groundbreaking US district and Spring Line, where the Spring Rock Green, and a lot more construction that's going on, it's much more big win-win for those who live on the turnpike. So that way, in the BRT comes, it should not be a problem if the 1A doesn't have any issue with the partnership.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right.
Introduce the next topic.
So next on the agenda are grant opportunities for FY.
All right, I'm just going to quickly highlight what either us or jurisdictional partners will be going after, or already have gone after for kind of FY25. So we're looking at for the TRIP program, there is a mid-cycle opportunity, and we are going to go after funds to continue to buy shelters and benches and put them in for the essential transit infrastructure. In regards to DRPT merit program, with some of the capital needs, we are going to kind of push forward some of those projects I mentioned above that are closing out. So for the transfer station, the permanent station will be well underway once the grant applications due. So we're hoping to be able to go after, if needed, acquisition and engineering funds. For our 325 Belt Boulevard, we want to go after engineering funds since the conceptual designs will have been done. And then since we want to pilot some battery electric buses, we'll need the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. So going after some funds for that. In regards to operational expansion needs in DRPT, we're going to go for some demo funds. One for a micro transit kind of East End, Sandston, that includes the airport, which will probably kind of be a replacement for the Route 56 as well. And then the Route 1 extension all the way up to Virginia Center Commons. For CVTA regional projects, the three that I'm aware of that were applied for with the jurisdictions, the city of Richmond applied for downtown transfer station, the BRT for Chamberlain, and then Henrico did the Western. And then for pilot program for transit oriented development is the last one. We did a co-application with the city of Richmond that just closed earlier this week, and that is for transit oriented development around the northern, so the Chamberlain Avenue from Chamberlain to from Azalea to Lombardi, to do improvements for land use and zoning and all of that, so it can be done in parallel as we move in future phases of this project. So as usual, quite a lot happening to get added on. What I just said. As we kind of, what I just mentioned is micro-trans, we're looking at doing another zone, which would include probably the area of 56.
I know there's a lot, as I see it, it's in peace. Given the fact that there's a lot of opportunities going on look at everything. And I think that residents who live in Mount Rose Heights and Darlington should have access over there for like 10 to 15 minutes without dealing with downtown to go there for 2 to 3 hours consuming any time. So I think it's better having for a will be extending up to Village of White Oaks, not only to access the jobs and employment, also connecting 7 and 91 in which those routes are moving.
Other business?
Question on the very first topic we talked about, which was the changes. Proposed changes, those were, from a budget standpoint, the additional cost of those runs is built into the ridership and, or has it already been that there is accounted for?
Because most of it is.
Okay.
And then.
Sorry, but
And the 19 also is a separate grant fund through some I-64 project. That's what we budgeted.
that was the only thing like.
Yes.
All right, if there's no other business, we'll adjourn.
Thank you.
Make some calls.
Gerald, did he cut it off? Dexter?
Yeah.
We'll see.
Okay. Okay. Well,
These are bad behavior.
no, I was gonna say, I want to do those first. Oh, yeah, we definitely need these.
Yeah, yes, I'll run those down first so she can.
Okay. Yeah, I've already seen these, I know.
I'm kind of under headline. I'm also new to Richmond. Did you have a card or anything?
So the,
I just left it.
Sorry, Nick.
is this still on?
Adrian, trying to get questions.
Oh,
Dexter's
I'll
turn
wait
off
till
here.